Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Always fun to dive deep.
Yeah, today we're going to be looking at some excerpts from the ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors, by Dr. Frances Cress Welsing.
Oh, wow.
Now, in this book, she really goes into some interesting and sometimes controversial arguments about race and power dynamics. And specifically, she uses symbolic interpretation to kind of break down a lot of different things going on around us.
Interesting.
So you might think, symbolic interpretation in a book about racism, what's that about?
Right.
Well, trust me, this is where things get really interesting.
I bet.
So we're going to kind of break down her central theories and see how she uses this idea of symbolism to understand pretty much everything around us.
Yeah, it's a fascinating approach.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that Dr. Welsing does that's so unique is that she doesn't just look at racism as it appears on the surface.
Right.
She digs deep, like way deep, and tries to connect it to a primal fear that she believes has shaped global power structures.
Okay, so let's unpack this primal fear.
Okay.
What is she talking about here?
Well, at the heart of her work, you'll find the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism, which suggests that white supremacy is a system that has been very carefully and meticulously crafted to prevent white genetic annihilation.
Whoa. Okay, white genetic annihilation.
Yeah.
That's pretty intense.
It is. And she argues that white people, being a global minority with recessive genes, right, developed this system as a way to maintain control and ensure their continued existence.
So she's saying this fear is like woven into the very fabric of society.
Yeah, woven in.
Wow.
And to understand this fear, Dr. Welsing takes us back to the origin of white-skinned people.
Okay.
Which she theorizes started with albino mutants born from black parents in Africa.
Hold on. So she's proposing like a completely different origin story for white people.
She is, and she uses this origin story to explain the feelings of alienation and anxiety and narcissism that she believes are prevalent in Western civilization.
Right.
You can imagine being born different, rejected, seen as deficient.
Yeah.
That would leave a mark, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Some psychological baggage there.
For sure.
But how does she connect this to like biblical narratives, for example?
Well, let's take the story of Adam and Eve, for example.
Okay.
Dr. Welsing interprets the shame associated with nakedness as being linked to the paleness of wolfed skin.
Interesting.
And the concept of original sin, the idea that we are all inherently flawed. She connects that to the act of self-reproduction, further reinforcing the idea of a genetic deficiency.
Wow. So she's saying that even our religious stories are kind of imbued with this deep-seated anxiety about whiteness?
And it goes even beyond that. Think about the Tarzan story.
Okay, yeah.
You have this white protagonist raised by apes.
Right.
His whiteness, initially a source of shame, ultimately becomes the driving force for his dominance.
So even in popular culture, she sees these themes of whiteness as both a weakness and a tool for power.
Precisely. It's about understanding the world through this lens of color confrontation, and suddenly even seemingly unrelated cultural phenomena start to make sense.
So this lens, this idea of color confrontation, that's key to understanding all the symbolic interpretation she offers throughout the book.
Absolutely. She analyzes symbols within Western culture, not at face value,
right,
but as reflections of these anxieties about white genetic survival.
For example, the cross and the crucifix, what's her take on those?
So this is where some people might find her interpretations challenging.
Okay.
Dr. Welsing sees the cross as a symbolic representation of black male genitalia.
Wait, hold on. The cross, a symbol of Christianity, is being interpreted as black male genitalia. Why?
Because she argues that black male genitalia represent a threat to white genetic survival, and the crucifixion of Jesus, who she identifies as black, becomes a symbolic act of neutralizing that threat.
Wow. So she's suggesting that even religious iconography isn't free from this underlying fear.
That's her argument, and it extends to the communion ritual as well. Consuming the blood and body of Christ in her interpretation becomes a symbolic desire to incorporate black genetic material.
That's a pretty bold interpretation.
It is, but remember, Dr. Welsing is urging us to look beyond the surface to uncover the deeper meanings embedded in our cultural practices.
Okay, so she's saying that even something as seemingly simple as communion could be tied back to this idea of white genetic survival.
Exactly, and if we follow this thread, it leads to some interesting questions about other seemingly unrelated aspects of Western culture.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, consider guns.
Okay.
Dr. Welsing interprets them as symbolic white penises, providing a sense of power and control in response to the perceived threat from black male genitalia.
Guns as symbolic penises.
Yeah.
That's a new one for me, but I can see how that interpretation ties back into this idea of power dynamics and control.
Exactly. And this symbolism can be seen in the language we use around guns, like son of a gun.
So phrases we use every day without even thinking about it could actually be rooted in this subconscious anxiety.
That's the idea. Dr. Welsing is suggesting that these anxieties are pervasive, impacting everything from our religious practices to our everyday language.
It's like she's peeling back layers of meaning we never even knew were there.
Yeah.
What other examples does she offer?
Well, let's look at ball games.
Okay.
She points to the symbolism of large brown balls, often the targets in these games, as representing black male genitalia. These are contrasted with small white balls.
So even something as seemingly innocent as a game of basketball or soccer could be seen through this lens of color confrontation.
That's Dr. Welsing's argument. She sees the rules, the objectives, the very structure of these games as reflecting white supremacy and the anxieties surrounding white genetic survival.
Oh no, this is really making me think about things in a new way.
And it doesn't stop there. Dr. Welsing extends this analysis to smoking objects as well. Large brown cigars versus small white cigarettes. Both become phallic symbols reflecting the same anxieties and desires.
So even our choice of smoking object, that's something seemingly personal, could be tied back to these larger cultural anxieties.
Exactly. It's all about understanding that in the ISIS papers, nothing is taken at face value.
Right.
Everything is a symbol, a clue, pointing back to the central theory of color confrontation.
It's a lot to take in, but it's definitely fascinating. But doesn't this raise questions about how these anxieties play out in the lives of black men?
It certainly does, and that's something Dr. Welsing addresses directly when she discusses the concept of black male passivity and effeminization.
Okay, let's dive into that next.
Dr. Welsing argues that the white supremacy system actively encourages the effeminization of black males as a way to neutralize their perceived threat.
So it's not just about physical dominance.
Right.
It's about undermining black masculinity on like a psychological and cultural level.
That's the argument, and she points to things like the use of terms like boy or baby to address black men, as well as the societal structures that limit their opportunities and make it harder for them to achieve positions of power.
And she even suggests that the adoption of feminine clothing styles by some black men could be an unconscious response to this pressure.
To conform to a less threatening image.
This whole concept is pretty unsettling. It's like we're talking about a deliberate attempt to strip away a group's identity and sense of self.
It's definitely a challenging aspect of Dr. Welsing's work to confront, but it raises important questions about how systems of oppression operate.
Right.
Not just through overt discrimination, but through these more subtle forms of manipulation and control.
So if we're talking about manipulation and control, does Dr. Welsing offer any solutions or ways to break free from these patterns?
The ISIS papers isn't really like a how-to manual for dismantling white supremacy.
Right.
It's more about awareness, about understanding the system and how it works.
Okay.
Encouraging critical thinking and self-reflection, both on an individual and a collective level.
So it's about recognizing the problem, but then taking that knowledge and using it to spark change.
Exactly. It's about challenging not only external structures, but also internalized beliefs and biases.
And that includes challenging those anxieties about white genetic annihilation that she argues are at the root of all of this.
Right. It's about recognizing how that fear, whether conscious or unconscious, can manifest in harmful ways.
And she uses some pretty strong language or examples to illustrate this fear.
Yeah.
Talking about things like the obsession with tanning.
That's one of her more thought-provoking interpretations. She suggests that the desire for a tan is more than just aesthetics.
Yeah.
It's a subconscious yearning to be part of the human family.
Wow.
To possess something that white people, genetically speaking, lack.
So it's not just about achieving a certain look, but about fulfilling a deeper, perhaps even primal longing.
That's the idea. And she connects this to other seemingly unrelated phenomena, like the preference for dark-colored foods and drinks.
Oh, interesting.
Which she ties back to the communion ritual.
That symbolic act of incorporating black genetic material. So she's saying that even our culinary preferences could be influenced by this underlying anxiety.
It's a fascinating proposition, isn't it? It makes you wonder how many of our everyday choices are shaped by forces we're not even aware of.
It's like she's giving us a whole new way of looking at the world, but some people might push back on these interpretations, arguing that they're too symbolic, too abstract. What would you say to that?
Dr. Welsing's work is definitely challenging, and it's not going to resonate with everyone.
Right.
But her point is that these symbols aren't arbitrary. They hold meaning, and they reflect deeper truths about our culture and ourselves.
So it's not about taking her interpretations as literal truth, but using them as a framework for understanding how these anxieties can permeate different aspects of our lives.
Exactly. It's about developing that critical lens, that ability to see beyond the surface and to question the motivations and meanings behind the things we often take for granted.
That makes sense. But going back to this idea of solutions, how do we move forward with this understanding? How do we actually create change?
Well, I think Dr. Welsing's work is most powerful when it encourages us to think critically and to question the assumptions we hold about race and power.
So it's not about providing a step-by-step guide,
Right.
but about empowering individuals to become more conscious and active participants in dismantling oppressive systems.
Right. It's about recognizing that true change requires both individual and collective effort, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and to challenge the status quo.
And that includes confronting the ways in which we might be complicit in perpetuating these systems, even unconsciously.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility for our own actions and choices.
Yeah.
And being willing to do the work of unlearning harmful beliefs and biases.
This is a lot to unpack.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Welsing's work is definitely challenging, but it also feels incredibly relevant.
Yeah.
Especially in today's world where issues of race and power are constantly in the spotlight.
It's a reminder that these conversations are complex.
Yeah.
And there are no easy answers. But the first step is to be willing to engage, to listen, and to learn.
And to keep asking those tough questions now. Earlier we touched on Dr. Welsing's analysis of Black male passivity and feminization.
Yes.
It's a concept that's hard to grapple with. Can you elaborate on why she sees this as such a crucial aspect of her theory?
It goes back to this idea of control and neutralization. Dr. Welsing argues that by encouraging the effeminization of Black men, the white supremacy system seeks to diminish their perceived threat and maintain its dominance.
So it's about stripping away their power, not just physically, but also by attacking their sense of masculinity and identity.
Precisely. And she provides numerous examples of how this plays out in society.
Like the use of terms like boy and baby to address Black men.
Right. These terms are often used in a way that infantilizes and diminishes their status as men.
And she also points to the lack of strong Black male role models in many communities, which she argues is a direct result of systemic barriers and limited opportunities.
Exactly. It's about creating a system where Black men are denied the resources and support they need to thrive, and then blaming them for the consequences of that deprivation.
And she even suggests that the adoption of certain clothing styles by some Black men could be an unconscious response to this pressure to conform to a less threatening image.
It's a fascinating observation. It makes you wonder how much of our behavior, even something as seemingly personal as our style choices, is shaped by these larger cultural forces.
It's a lot to think about, and it raises the question, if these anxieties are so deeply ingrained in our culture, how do we even begin to address them?
That's the challenge, isn't it? But I think Dr. Welsing's work, even with its controversial elements, provides valuable insights into how these anxieties operate and how they manifest in our world.
So it's not about agreeing with everything she says, but about using her work as a starting point for deeper reflection and critical analysis.
Exactly. It's about engaging with her ideas, challenging them where necessary, and ultimately using them to spark meaningful conversations about race power and the need for systemic change.
And speaking of change, we haven't yet touched on Dr. Welsing's reinterpretation of Freudian psychoanalysis. How does that fit into her larger theory?
That's where she really gets into the psychological underpinnings of these anxieties. She takes a concept that's traditionally seen through a very specific lens and turns it on its head.
You're talking about the concept of penis envy.
Exactly. Now, traditionally, this is interpreted as women envying men's genitalia.
Yeah, that classic Freudian interpretation.
But Dr. Welsing flips the script. She suggests that the envy actually originates from white males' perception of Black male genitalia as a threat.
So it's not about women wanting what men have, but white men feeling threatened by what Black men possess.
Precisely. It's about a perceived threat to their power and dominance.
And she argues that this anxiety is then projected onto white women.
Yeah.
Contributing to white male dominance over both white females and Black males.
It's a complex and challenging interpretation, but it highlights how Dr. Welsing seeks to connect these seemingly disparate phenomena back to her central thesis of color confrontation and the anxieties surrounding white genetic survival.
It's like she's saying that these anxieties are so deeply rooted that they even shape our understanding of basic psychological concepts.
That's the power of her work.
Yeah.
It makes you re-examine everything you thought you knew and consider alternative perspectives.
It's definitely challenging, but it's also incredibly thought-provoking. So where do we go from here? How do we take all of this information and apply it to our own lives?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It feels like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, I think Dr. Welsing would agree with you. Her work isn't meant to provide easy answers.
Right.
It's meant to spark a journey of self-discovery and critical reflection.
So where do we even begin? If these anxieties are so deeply embedded in our culture and our subconscious, how do we even recognize them, let alone challenge them?
Well, I think the first step, as with most things, is awareness. It's about paying attention to the symbols, the language, the behaviors that surround us.
So not just accepting things at face value,
Right.
but really digging deeper, asking those tough questions about why things are the way they are. Exactly why do we use certain terms? What are the historical roots of certain practices? Who benefits from the perpetuation of certain narratives?
So it's about becoming more conscious consumers of information, more critical thinkers.
Yes.
And ultimately more active participants in shaping the world around us.
Precisely. And I think Dr. Welsing's work provides a valuable framework for doing just that. Even if you don't agree with all of her interpretations,
Right.
Her approach encourages us to look beyond the surface and to question the assumptions we hold about race power and the very symbols that shape our reality.
It's like she's giving us a new set of lenses through which to view the world.
And with that new perspective comes a sense of agency, the ability to recognize patterns and to make more conscious choices about how we participate in them.
So it's not about feeling overwhelmed or paralyzed by these complex systems,
Right.
but about using this knowledge to empower ourselves and to create change.
Absolutely. Remember, Dr. Welsing's work is ultimately about liberation, about recognizing the ways in which these anxieties limit us, and about breaking free from those constraints.
And that liberation starts with each of us.
Yes.
With our own individual choices and actions.
It does. It starts with becoming aware of our own biases, with challenging the narratives we've been taught, and with being willing to engage in uncomfortable conversations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the ISIS papers, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the importance of questioning everything. Don't just accept things as they are. Look deeper, challenge assumptions, and be willing to consider alternative perspectives.
Yeah.
Dr. Welsing's work, whether you agree with it or not, forces us to do just that.
And that's a powerful thing. It's about reclaiming our agency, about understanding the forces that shape our world, and about using that knowledge to create a more just and equitable future for all.
Well said.
So as you go about your day, I encourage you to keep Dr. Welsing's words in mind. Notice the symbols around you, question their origins, and consider how they might be perpetuating or challenging the systems of power we've been discussing. Remember, even the smallest actions can contribute to creating a more just and equitable world. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.